So I think that we'll get started and we'll probably have some more attendees come in. But good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's program. Whatever we'll sell, they will take. Trafficking of wildlife, resources, cultural artifacts, and humans in times of conflict or disruption. My name is Andrew Schatz, and I'll be moderating today's panel. Today's panel is presented by the American Bar Association's International Law Section, International Animal Law Committee. It is co-sponsored by many entities, including the ABA International Law Section's Art and Cultural Heritage Law Committee, the International Criminal Law Committee, and the International Human Rights Committee, the ABA section of Environment, Energy, and Resources, Endangered Species Committee, and the International Environmental and Resources Law Committee, as well as the ABA Tort Trial and Insurance Practice Section Animal Law Committee. Finally, in cooperation with the Environmental Law Institute. So thank you to all of our co-sponsors. Likewise, I want to thank Susan Schwartz and Lauren Meskey for their help in putting on the program. So thank you. So today's program seeks to examine the illegal activities and methods used by traffickers to loot the cultural, human, wildlife, and resource wealth of our planet amid turmoil, whether that turmoil be created by war, natural disaster, disease, or economic instability. We will explore the role of organized crime and the impacts of trafficking, such as decimation of wildlife species, proliferation of zoonotic pathogens, looting of cultural artifacts, and human toll for victims of human sex trafficking. Finally, we'll discuss legal and enforcement strategies and reforms needed to quell trafficking. So I'll start off today's discussion with some introductions, which will be followed by speaker presentations for the next hour. And we'll conclude with about 30 minutes of question and answer. If you do have any questions for the panelists, I would ask that you please use the Q&A function on the bottom of the Zoom toolbar as opposed to the chat function. And now for our speakers. So my name again is Andrew Schatz, and I'll be moderating the panel. I'm a legal advisor for conservation finance and wildlife at Conservation International, where I advise on, among other things, wildlife law reform in foreign countries and capacity building to combat wildlife trafficking. So we're joined today by a very distinguished panel of speakers. Dr. Juliana Machado Ferreira is the founding member and executive director of Freeland Brazil, the South American branch of Freeland Global. Juliana has a degree in biological sciences with a master's of science and a PhD in biology from the University of Sao Paulo. Juliana has previously worked or partnered with SOS Fauna and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's National Forensics Laboratory, and she was a TED Senior Fellow from 2010 to 2012 and named a National Geographic Emerging Explorer in 2014. Dr. Tanya Wyatt is professor of criminology at Northumbria University in Newcastle, United Kingdom. She's a green criminologist specializing in wildlife crime and trafficking, as well as non-human animal welfare. Her latest books are Is CITES Protecting Wildlife and Wildlife Trafficking, a deconstruction of the crime, the victims, and the offenders, second edition. To close off our wildlife discussion, we have John Scanlon, AO, who served as Secretary General of the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, otherwise known as CITES. You'll hear that a lot. And John served from 2010 to 2018. He is now CEO of the Elephant Protection Initiative Foundation, chair of the Global Initiative to End Wildlife Crime, and chair of the UK government's Illegal Wildlife Trade Challenge Fund. John has worked in the private sector, government, and in senior positions with IUCN and UNEP. He holds a Bachelor of Laws, Master of Laws, Environmental, and is an accredited mediator. In 2019, John was awarded the prestigious Officer of the Order of Australia, AO, for distinguished service to wildlife conservation and protection through roles with international organizations. Next, Peter Tomka. Peter Tomka, serves as the Executive Director of Global Heritage Alliance, an advocacy organization for museums, collectors, and the small businesses of the art and antiquities trade. He has appeared in numerous trial and appellate courts. He has lobbied members of the US Congress and the executive branch in an effort to ensure that his small business clients receive fair treatment from federal regulators. His advocacy has received notice in the media, including the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Art newspaper, CBS News, and the Voice of America. Peter also serves as the co-chair of the ABA SIL Art and Cultural Heritage Committee. Finally, Jane Craden is a criminal prosecutor with almost 25 years of experience at the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office. Jane is a subject matter expert on human sex trafficking in California and has a background in sex crimes prosecution. As the former head of the DA's office's human sex trafficking section, she had responsibility for reviewing sex trafficking cases for filing consideration, prosecuting human trafficking cases, training law enforcement and deputy district attorneys, community outreach, and working on legislation while safeguarding the rights of victims. Thank you to all of our speakers for joining us. So just to give you a little order of presentation, Juliana will start off the panel with an overview of wildlife trafficking in Brazil. Tanya will examine the differentiating wildlife trafficking criminal networks from organized criminal groups, corporate crime groups, and disorganized networks. John will follow with the discussion on COVID-19, emerging infectious diseases, and links to international wildlife laws and calls for their reform. Peter will continue our smorgasbord of trafficking offenses, looking at the cultural artifacts, trafficking, and legal responses when you don't have Indiana Jones to save the day. And then finally, Jane will finish with a discussion on human sex trafficking, victims and perpetrators, and efforts to crack down on it. So Juliana, would you like to start us off?
Yes, thank you so much. And I will try to make this work because we have before. Oops. I trust you can see my slide right now. Yeah, okay. So
yes.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a big honor to be here with my heroes and role models. So while the world has a correct priority to try to keep forests standing up, it is important, especially now during the pandemic, to understand that in order to be healthy, ecosystems need animals and the maintenance of all interactions between the components of biodiversity. So although it is smaller in volume and in illegal resources than, for example, illegal logging or deforestation, wildlife trafficking is a serious crime, ranked among the most relevant transnational crimes and with an estimated value of up to 20 billion US dollars per year. And in order to supply many different kinds of consumer markets for wildlife products, which range from status objects to traditional medicine items, fashion items, culinary delicacies, to collectors and owners of the so-called exotic animals, traffickers are stealing from nature millions of animals every year. But this uncontrolled and inadequate exploitation of wildlife has a price, which is turning out to be a very high one. I would love to spend an entire hour just talking to you about the impacts of wildlife trafficking, but today it won't be possible. So in short, very short, wildlife trafficking encompasses severe violations of animal welfare, major threats to public health with known and new diseases of zoonotic origin, the danger of spreading invasive species and their diseases, which are threats to global biodiversity, negative impacts in the species' evolutionary potential, which can lead to their extinction, loss of ecological functions, which can affect the health of ecosystems and the ecosystem services that they provide, and impacts on governance and rule of law, since wildlife trafficking can only happen in conjunction with other crimes. So Brazil has been under the spotlight as we witness a growth in illegal deforestation. And I was asked here to give a brief overview on what's going on with wildlife trafficking, since we are one of the countries that kill the most environmental activists. And now, as the entire world, we are going through the COVID pandemic. So as the top mega diversity country on the planet, with severe social inequality, some degree of political instability, porous borders, and lenient environmental laws, we have the perfect mix for high wildlife trafficking, high levels of wildlife trafficking. But curiously enough, this is not what numbers are showing. So what's going on? I believe that Brazil is stuck in what I like to call the data paradox. See, we have several governmental institutions in the municipal, state, and federal levels, in the criminal and in the administrative spheres, responsible for countering wildlife trafficking. However, not only coordination between them would need to be improved, but they don't record data in a standardized way. And therefore, we do not have any consolidated data or information on the amount of wildlife and wildlife products that are seized in Brazil. Nonetheless, it is the perception of many experts in the area that what we are seizing is only a minor share of what is actually being trafficked. And of course, what is seized doesn't necessarily reflect what is being trafficked. It reflects what we are able to detect and interdict, but we don't even have that information in order to direct our limited resources. So we don't have enough data to show how relevant wildlife trafficking really is in Brazil, and therefore there is no prioritization, no increase in detection, and no data to show the relevance of the problem. As with other countries, we have the domestic wildlife trafficking within our borders, the cross-border wildlife trafficking with Brazil as a source, the cross-border with Brazil as a consumer, which seems to be growing recently, and of course, Brazil as a transit route. So very quickly, the main driver of the domestic wildlife trafficking in Brazil is the habit of keeping songbirds, parrots, macaws, tortoises. This is a difficult word for me, tortoises, and monkeys as pets present throughout the country. There are other drivers, such as, for example, the legal trade in wild meat or bushmeat, which are also very relevant. But as I mentioned, we don't have a consolidated statistics of seizures, but we do have different numbers that indicate how voluminous this actually is. So just as a few examples, a study estimated that 8 street markets could be illegally trading 50,000 birds per year, 16,000 of just one species. In a period of 1 year, the federal police seized in the state of Amazonas alone more than 3,400 eggs of freshwater turtles, more than 14,000 ornamental fish. Wildlife reception centers managed by the Federal Environmental Agency received in 2018 alone 72,000 live animals. And a counter wildlife trafficking operation found that up to 200,000 rings or leg bands used to identify birds were being used per year to launder poached songbirds into the legal supply chain. Just one law enforcement agency in this state painted in red here seized in a period of 1.5 years more than 82,000 animals, more than 60% of which from just these 5 species. This is how they're transported in cars, buses, and even airplanes. And information from law enforcement agencies account that the pandemic made their sense of impunity even bigger, so it could be increasing wildlife trafficking. Now, concerning the cross-border trafficking, Brazil is known to be the source of a very, very wide array of species and wildlife products trafficked to North America, Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, sometimes directly and sometimes using other countries as routes. However, we don't have many major seizures, especially, for example, seizures in ports or from air freight. This may be because perhaps there are no big shipments of illegal wildlife from Brazil, or maybe because no one was actually looking for them. Why should I be suspicious of this container of scrap plastic or this cargo of frozen fish? There have been seizures in mail parcels and some seizures in airports from passengers, but there have been very little seizures from, for example, made in ports. Therefore, it is likely that a lot of wildlife and wildlife products are leaving Brazil smuggled with passengers in their luggage, but mixed with legal products, with fake permits, or with real permits obtained from false information. And concerning the connection with other crimes, there is some information that the same traffickers who bring in drugs and counterfeit products are also returning to their countries with illegal wildlife. This is the classic example of traffickers carrying eggs and birds, mainly parrots and macaws. And my time is almost up, but I love this example. It started as a small operation, and it ended up dismantling a criminal organization that trafficked animals from Brazil into 6 countries, and mainly exported with fake documentation obtained with legalized breeders. And now Brazil has also been growing as a relevant consumer of wildlife from other countries, especially reptiles from Africa and Asia. So on top of the lack of interagency coordination and of consolidated data, wildlife trafficking is not considered as a serious crime under the Brazilian legislation. The low penalties assigned allow for settlement agreements, and sometimes the settlement agreements are offered when they should not be because the circumstances are not present. Being a lesser crime also involves a difficult access of investigative tools to agents, for example, like controlled deliveries. The situation culminates with widespread sense of impunity and high recurrence rates among traffickers, with decent profits and low risks. And lastly, countries with a lenient legislation end up becoming trafficking havens to traffickers. So in order to start to turn the situation around, Brazil needs to urgently set wildlife trafficking as a serious crime, enhance data collection and analysis and interagency coordination, and of course, origin traceability tools. All of which I think it would be beautifully organized under the umbrella of a national strategy for combating wildlife trafficking. And of course, very relevant that we support the protocol on wildlife crime under the UN Convention on Organized Crime proposed by the Global Initiative to End Wildlife Crime. As we go through the 6th mass extinction and a global pandemic, we cannot underestimate the importance of animals in the maintenance of healthy ecosystems. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Juliana.
10 minutes sharp. I deserve a medal.
That was great. Thank you. Tanya, if you would lead us off next.
Yep, here we go. Yeah, thank you so much for that, Juliana. I think that's an excellent connection to what I'm going to be speaking about. And you can see from my screen there that, and as Juliana really gave excellent examples of, we talk about wildlife trafficking, but it's not the same. It's not homogenous by any means. There's so many different forms of wildlife trafficking, and it could be the pet trade for frogs and amphibians, reptiles, and a whole number of species. Songbirds, not only for singing in competitions, but for luxury foods in parts of Europe. Ivory, obviously, is a huge part of wildlife trafficking. And then let's not forget about the plants, because there is a huge market for illegal plants as well. And the picture there is a range of cacti or succulents that you might find on a black market. So we have all of this diversity, and there isn't a one size fits all that's going to work. And we do need to look at it in all of its complexity. So colleagues and I have talked about trying to unpack and categorize what these networks for all of these different types of trades might actually look like. And the purpose for doing that is always a practical one. How can we help police, law enforcement, prosecutors, judges to know who all the actors are that are acting in this sphere, so that we can actually reduce wildlife trafficking, and better yet, to actually prevent wildlife trafficking for all of those welfare and extinction issues that Juliana already outlined. So my colleagues and I have proposed that we should really not just be looking at the opportunistic poacher necessarily, and obviously poverty plays a role in all of this, and there is subsistence poaching and things happening. But there are these clear actors that don't probably get talked about in enough detail or accurately enough. And the first of those that we talk about and that we've researched ourselves are organized crime groups. Now, this is nothing new. We see organized crime groups engaged in the range of black markets that we see all over the world. But we do need to have some sort of consensus around definition. And of course, the United Nations Convention on Transnational Organized Crime has a very broad definition that just is about 3 people and time. And so lots of different kinds of activity could be considered organized crime under that definition. So there does need to be some harmonization going on when we're talking about organized crime groups in the context of wildlife trafficking. What we propose around organized crime groups, what they look like, they are much more sophisticated than other kinds of networks that we might see. And there is probably an element of violence in there somewhere. And they're definitely linked to corruption in many ways that we see in terms of different wildlife black markets. Organized crime groups are also adaptable, they're resilient, so they have that long life that we see for a number of different well-known kinds of groups. And in particular, they work in the underworld and the upper world. So it might be a wildlife black market that is linked into the legal trade as well. And some examples, just briefly, that we would argue are likely to be facilitated by organized crime groups are Caviar. So my co-author on these studies, Dr. Don Bono at Utrecht University, did an amazing ethnographic study of caviar in the Caspian Sea and saw how you have links of organized crime groups who bribe police and get the caviar into the actual legal trade. And then there's a whole side black market around caviar containers that the illegal caviar will go into, or the laundered caviar, because there's farming going on here as well. So this really complicated kind of market where we need where an organized crime group can step in to fulfill that kind of sophistication needed. And in the middle there, you'll see around corporate crime groups, and this is one that I've been speaking much more about lately, is that we can't miss out, I think, on all of this in our efforts to prosecute and to hold people accountable, the role of business and corporations. As Juliana mentioned in her example, so around the pet trade, horticulture, traditional medicines, there are companies and businesses involved in all of that. And that corporate crime often sits outside the criminal law. So we need to be much more innovative in holding those types of criminals to account, be that administrative or civil opportunities. And there is a sense what gets called in the criminological literature around organizational deviance is that you might have companies that aren't just doing this once in a while, but it's part of how they do business. And so there is that legal, very public face, but then there is that underlying layer of illegality as well. And this shouldn't be confused with organized crime groups, which are distinct, but it is structured, it is organized, and so it can be very pervasive. And then finally, the disorganized networks. These are less structured, but there is organization. You will have some amount of structure to them. These groups, we argue, might act more opportunistically, taking advantage of an opportunity as it arises. They may not be just wedded to one particular wildlife, but if something comes up, they might engage in that as well. So they're very flexible, but you have individual actors acting along that. So it might be, as in the picture just showed of the guy with the eggs taped to him, he might be one individual actor in a disorganized network. And all of these require a different law enforcement response and a different criminal justice response. What we're arguing there is that there is all level of organization then, with organized crime and corporate crime being the most organized, and then the disorganized crime having some structure but being less structured. The disorganized crime are the most opportunistic, whereas organized crime and corporate crime might be less so because they have their already established infrastructure. And in the case of corporate crime, would actually have a legal business that they're already operating. And we argue that the organized crime groups are the ones that are most linked to other crimes, whereas corporate crime might be less so, and disorganized crime sort of in the middle there, where they might be involved in not just wildlife black markets, but other black markets too. And then links to corruption. As I mentioned, organized crime we know is very closely tied to corruption, with the others being somewhat less so. And you can see just the citation from my colleagues, Dr. Von Neumann, Dr. Nurse there at the bottom. These aren't necessarily completely distinct. There are overlaps where we see organized crime working with corporate crime, where we see disorganized crime working in and out of its, popping in and out of a supply chain for organized or corporate groups. There is some distinction, we argue, between them, but they can be very fluid, and they can cooperate and work together. And then finally, we just some thoughts to end with on the group nature and some key characteristics. That we do know that low sentencing that we've heard about is why organized crime might be attracted to that. And so efforts to increase sentencing could be really useful in that sense. And the Untitled Force Protocol is certainly one of those. Poaching of wildlife does take place in states that are weaker or regions that are weaker. And there really is this symbiotic relationship between what gets called the under and the upper world. There's this legal-illegal interface. And so these are points in supply chains that we should be targeting for prevention and disruption. And as we have global scarcity of wildlife rising, these are only going to attract more criminals into these networks. So we'd predict that wildlife trafficking is going to continue to increase, or to be really resilient in the years ahead, when we have uncertainty and scarcity probably growing. But thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Tanya. That was great. So I think that I'll let John take over next.
Great, thanks, Andrew. Thanks to the sponsors and co-sponsors for the invitation to join you today, much appreciated. And big thanks to Juliana and Tanya for these fantastic presentations, very insightful, and have set the scene fantastically. This devastating pandemic that we're currently living through has been omnipresent over the past year. Governments struggling to stop it from spreading, striving to vaccinate us against it. And I just got my first jab of Moderna a couple of weeks back, and working to understand its origins. At some stage, we're going to get through it, but when we do, it won't be over. In fact, far from it. According to a recent World Health Organization report, the most likely explanation of COVID-19 is that the virus jumped from an animal, such as a bat, to humans via another animal. And one of the authors of the report suggests that the virus may have jumped from bats to animals in a wildlife farm, which was supplying an animal market. Now, while it's still too early to draw any final conclusions about the origins of COVID-19, the links between wildlife and previous epidemics and pandemics are well known, as are the conditions that make the spillover of viruses from animals to humans more likely. Health and wildlife experts have warned us for decades of the public health risk associated with people mixing with wild animals, including through habitat destruction, illegal or poorly regulated wildlife trade, and through the sale of wildlife at markets that bring together wild, captively bred, and domesticated animals. Now, in saying so, it's important to remember that when left alone, wild animals pose no risk to human health. The risk comes from how we, as people, interact with wildlife. And just last year, the UN IPBES released a report telling us that an astonishing 1.7 million undiscovered viruses are thought to exist in wild animals, about half of which could spill over to people. And scientists also tell us that more than 60% of emerging infectious diseases are zoonotic, namely they can spill over from non-human animals to humans. And more than 70% of these are from wild animals. Now, it's not just the health risk that we need to be concerned about. In addition to these risks, the UN IPBES predicts that due to our actions, over 1 million species will go extinct over the coming decades, including due to overexploitation and the loss of wildlife habitat, unless we change course. Now, climate change is also high on the international agenda. And our response to help mitigate climate change is nature-based solutions, or one of our responses is nature-based solutions. Now, they can offer about 1/3 of the cost-effective carbon dioxide mitigation needed between now and 2030. Yet habitat loss, the overexploitation of wildlife, including for illegal trade, degrades ecosystems and their ability to mitigate climate change. And the dramatic and sudden loss of revenue from wildlife tourism in 2020 due to the pandemic sent shockwaves through the conservation community, decimating jobs, enterprises, and livelihoods. And this loss of tourism has in turn negatively affected the ability of countries to manage wildlife in protected areas, which is further exacerbating these threats to our biodiversity, climate, and public health. If nothing else, this COVID-19 pandemic has reminded us, albeit in a devastating way, of the interconnected nature of things, most particularly between economies, the environment, human and animal health and welfare. We need to recalibrate our relationship with nature for many compelling interrelated reasons, including to protect biodiversity, including wildlife, combat climate change, and to prevent future pandemics. And this is going to require profound changes in how we regulate the taking, trade, and consumption of wildlife, and how we combat wildlife crime, and how we manage and finance the protection of wildlife at its source. Now, I'm briefly going to touch upon the first two of these issues today. Now, as Andrew mentioned, I'm chair of a global initiative known as the Global Initiative to End Wildlife Crime. And we're a diverse group of people and organizations coming from across every continent. And we've joined forces to promote changes to our international laws to ensure that we give ourselves the best chance of avoiding the next pandemic, as well as for achieving multiple other benefits. And our initiative has concluded that the current international regime for regulating wildlife trade and combating wildlife crime, including illegal wildlife trade, is inadequate, both for regulating the trade, markets, and consumption that pose a risk to public health, as well as for ending wildlife crime. Now, let me share with you our concerns about existing wildlife trade and wildlife crime laws in a little more detail, and briefly outline our suggested reforms. Firstly, on wildlife trade, the international agreement that exists to regulate trade in wildlife, known by its acronym CITES, takes decisions based solely on biological and trade criteria. It looks to see if any trade will affect the survival of the species of animal or plant that is being traded. It does not pay any attention to the risk that such trade could pose to human health or animal health. Now, this needs to change. Regulating wildlife trade needs to be based on a One Health approach, where biological, human health, and animal health criteria are all taken into consideration. Now, we're already seeing some states start to impose further restrictions on trade and markets, for example, in China, Gabon, Italy, and Vietnam. And the WTO, the OIE, the World Animal Health Organization, and UNEP have called on national competent authorities to suspend the trade in live caught wild animals of mammalian species for food or breeding purposes, and to close sections of food markets selling live caught wild animals of mammalian species as an emergency measure. But human memories are short, and this is clear from the responses to previous pandemics. And if we're going to succeed in preventing future pandemics, we need to hardwire a One Health approach into the international legal framework. Now, there are several viable options available to achieve this objective. Time prevents me from discussing them all, but the most cost-effective and efficient way of doing this is for states to adopt amendments to the CITES agreement that build human and animal health criteria into decision-making processes and to extend its reach to wildlife markets. Now, we know how to do this, and we've drafted a set of proposed amendments which are available online. Now, secondly, moving to wildlife crime. In addition to posing a threat to human and animal health, wildlife crimes are driving many species towards extinction, as we've just heard, degrading entire ecosystems and their ability to sequester carbon, depriving governments of revenue, exacerbating corruption, insecurity, and poverty. And if we include the impacts of these crimes on ecosystems, then the World Bank estimates their value at a staggering $1 to $2 trillion a year. Now, further, as more restrictions are imposed on certain wildlife trade and markets, it's going to require an enhanced collaborative enforcement effort to ensure such activities do not just move underground. But notwithstanding the destructive and high-risk nature of these crimes to both people and wildlife, there is no global agreement on wildlife crime, as there is, for example, on human trafficking. Humans and wildlife are losing. And the stark reality is that, left as it is, our system is not going to end these crimes or work to prevent the next pandemic. For the reasons you've just heard from the earlier speakers, we need to embed preventing and combating wildlife crime where it belongs, namely into the international criminal law framework. And I am delighted to inform you that just yesterday, the President of Gabon, His Excellency Ali Bongo Ondimba, and the President of Costa Rica, His Excellency Carlos Alvarado Quesada, jointly called for preventing and combating wildlife crime to be embedded into the international criminal law framework by developing a new global agreement on wildlife crime, taking the form of a fourth protocol under the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. Now, this visionary call has been made by the presidents of two countries that have been environmental leaders, countries that have set aside vast areas of marine and terrestrial protected areas and led efforts to combat illicit trafficking of wild fauna and flora. Colleagues, the world is still feeling the full brunt of a pandemic, which most likely had its origins in a wild animal. We're advised that there are hundreds of thousands of new viruses that could spill over from wildlife to humans. We're struggling to combat climate change and staring down the loss of 1 million species. Given the scale of the risk to people and planet, we simply cannot stand by and watch wildlife continue to disappear without ratcheting up our collective response, including to our international wildlife trade and wildlife crime laws. And I'd like to finish with a quote from the presidents of Costa Rica and Gabon, who yesterday issued a statement that included the following: if we aspire to meet our global commitments to tackle biodiversity loss and climate change, as well as emerging efforts to prevent future wildlife-related pandemics, then countries must step up and treat wildlife crime as the serious and highly destructive crime that it is. In the face of these immediate and interconnected crises, we must act swiftly. If we can collectively muster the will to end the scourge of wildlife trafficking, we will leave an enduring legacy for generations to come. And colleagues, today I reach out to all of you who are participating in this webinar to get fully behind this visionary statement made by the two presidents, and to publicly express your support to them and to actively encourage other states to heed their call. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you, John. And that's fantastic and incredibly encouraging. So I'm glad to see both Costa Rica and Gabon on board. Peter, I'm going to share your slides. Anyway, I'll let you get started.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the other speakers. It was very fascinating speaking about things that I'm not quite up on. So now for something completely different, I'm going to talk about cultural artifacts. Obviously, the biggest difference is that cultural artifacts are not alive like the endangered species that we were speaking about. There are some parallels, there are certainly some differences. Why don't you go to the second slide? Anyway, antiquities have been really bought and sold for many, many years. There's references in ancient sources that the Emperor Augustus collected antiquities. There's lots of literature from ancient times that talks about the looting by the Romans of Greek statuary, especially to put in their fine houses. So collecting has been around for a long time. Whether something is trafficked really depends upon whether or not it's sold illicitly or licitly. Here in the United States and in many Western European countries and other countries, there's a long established antiquities market that's quite legal. But there are some antiquities from other sources get into that market, and that's where we get into the trafficking. So the sort of the discussion about antiquities trafficking has really come into the news with the rise of ISIS and other terrorist groups. And there's been a lot of information in the news about items being looted from archaeological sites in Syria and being sold on the market. Initially, when those reports came out, they were very inflated. There were some statements to the effect that illicit antiquities was the second largest funding source for ISIS after hot oil. Where this came from, I mean, basically a lot of the information came from Syrian government, Russian government, and then also the Iraqi government, which had their own reasons to push this type of information. And then it was amplified here in the United States by archaeological advocacy groups who were just broadly opposed to private collecting. In any case, since that time, there's been more sober analysis of the issue by GAO, the RAND Corporation, and others who suggest that the actual amounts that we're talking about are much, much less. And not to say that it's not an issue at all, but the attributable figures seem to be in the high hundred thousands of dollars to the low millions, which of course is very, very low compared to what was argued previously, where there were arguments about hundreds of millions of dollars, et cetera. The other interesting thing to consider with this is that, and it's a complicating factor, is in these countries, which is the MENA region, the Middle Eastern and North African region, these places are run by authoritarian governments, which really declare pretty much everything and anything old to be state property. And in a lot of these places, in fact, all of them, there was illicit antiquities trade, which started to get cracked down upon in the 1930s. And in places such as Egypt, there was open sales of antiquities till the early 80s when the Mubarak dictatorship cracked down on it. And what happened was, what was previously illicit trade basically went underground. And, for some things, minor things like coins and oil lamps and such, didn't even go that far underground, because that kind of material in many places is still openly sold with the full knowledge of the authorities. So, there's two groups then. So there's these people who worked in this area for, many, many years, who, when the laws changed, they didn't change their activities. So there's still the same people whose families were selling this stuff in the 1930s, et cetera, are still doing it now. But there are, of course, terrorist groups and criminal enterprises like the mafia that also get involved on an opportunistic basis, who sell things, if it has a value and it's illicit, and they can use their contacts with corrupt government officials to get it out of the area they can. So that's kind of what's going on here. So it's kind of a mixed bag essentially, and I've heard some of that same kind of ways things are leave the country from wildlife as well. But again, this is a little bit more specialized. This trade has been going on for a very, very long time, and parts of it are illicit, others parts are illicit. Let's go to the next slide. So there are a bunch of federal laws that look at this. I'm sorry, if you go back to the other, I'm sorry, the previous slide. There are a number of federal laws that deal with this, and they basically deal with things on entry to the United States, and that's sort of the trigger for when federal authorities can look at things. So the three main ways that federal authorities address these issues are by finding misrepresentations on the customs forms. And this typically is either a misrepresentation as to the value of the object, or misrepresentation as to what the object is. And so that's smuggling, basically. In terms of values, sometimes the values put down, it's not necessarily in an effort to escape detection from federal authorities, but because actually a lot of this material comes in duty free. but it's really to avoid theft in the mails, that kind of thing. But still, nonetheless, if you put down the wrong value, or you put down the wrong country of origin, and when they talk about country of origin for antiquities, it's the country of manufacture. That is a basis for detention, seizure, and forfeiture. In terms of country of origin, sometimes that's kind of difficult to tell. And I don't know if anyone's seen in the papers recently, there was a seizure of a Roman statue, which apparently Kim Kardashian had an interest in, believe it or not. So if you read through the complaint, and then also the federal complaint, and also some of the news coverage, it looks like one of the issues there is, whether the fact that the importers fudged on the issue of whether or not it was Italian or not had to do with the fact that it was Roman, and of course the Roman Empire stretched far beyond the current Italy. So that's one issue. I see my time's going, so let me keep on moving on. So there's another one where their items are considered stolen under foreign law. And these are national patrimony laws which declare the state property. The last one is import restrictions on the Cultural Property Implementation Act, which is a specialized statute which basically limits the imports of archaeological or ethnological objects. So in any event, there's some controversies that come up from all these laws. So the first is with country of origin valuation issues related to misrepresentations on the customs form. And I somewhat addressed that, but there can be reasons why values are not necessarily that easy to determine, or countries of origin are not that easy to determine. With respect to stolen property, in order for the National Stolen Property Act to come in, there has to be a national patrimony law that's being violated, one that vests title of an ancient artifact in the state, normally because it was illicitly excavated. But there are issues that come up when there's open markets for the same exact materials in the country that is claiming them to be stolen property, because one of the provisions of the statute of case law that has looked at this is that the foreign country actually has to apply its laws consistently at home. So if they allow similar material to be sold in a foreign country, that sort of vitiates that. Then there's also the issue of import restrictions. There's confusion as to whether or not import restrictions are based upon the country of origin or the find spot. If you look at the statute, it's really the find spot, but customs often conflates the two, and they're very different for certain objects, particularly coins. And then there's also an issue of do restrictions only apply to artifacts illicitly exported after the effective date? So is it a prospective restriction, or is it an embargo on things coming into the country after the effective date of regulations? Again, that's an issue that's a controversy in the area. And finally, there's a burden of proof question too on these type cases. So with that, let me end and look forward to any questions. Thank you again.
Okay, I think, thank you, Peter. I think that we'll let Jane finish off the panel. Oh, wait, you're on mute.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, because I know we're spread out all over. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this panel. Well, in Los Angeles, in California, we saw a shift from what we once had, which was an overemphasis on drug trafficking. Why drug trafficking is still huge in California and Los Angeles County, where I live, we saw the shift to trafficking in persons, more so with children. And we were looking at, well, why this shift? Why this change? Well, in 2012, or pre-2012, we had laws in California that were really, really weak. And because the laws dealing with human trafficking were weak, one of the reasons, or that was theorized, is it promulgated all of these people now shifting to trafficking in persons, because there's really very little punishment. Also, if there's an endless supply of young people, and there's an endless supply, yes, there are men who are trafficked, but the vast majority, at least in California and across the US, are women and children. And they were saying that when you're dealing with drugs, you sell drugs and it's a commodity, you sell it once and you can only sell it once. With humans, unfortunately, it's a commodity that can be used over and over again until that particular commodity outlives its usefulness. We've had cases where they've had quotas, where the traffickers give their girls quotas of minimum $300 per day, up to over $1,000 per day that they need to earn by commercial sexual activity. And in 2012, they said, okay, we need to come up with something to put a stop to this, at least make it painful to the trafficker. So there was a law that was passed. It was called Prop 35, and it had an 81% passage rate. That is the highest proposition that's ever been passed in California. And what that proposition did, it put in strong laws to really make trafficking not so profitable. So it was working for a while. We've had some sentences where traffickers got multiple life sentences for their conduct. And part of what that bill did, it also allowed money to be put into the enforcement. And so now we had strong laws, we had money for enforcement. And what we did in California as part of our enforcement technique was collaboration. California, or Los Angeles County, is so large that we have several different counties, and each county may have different law enforcement agencies. And we also have the federal government, which oversees all of the states. And what we were finding is that traffickers can go from county to county, be in different states throughout the United States, and we're not talking to each other. So part of our lack of enforcement and part of our issues was the fact that everyone had their own silos. Everyone was working within their four squares, working with their law enforcement agency, their prosecutorial agency. However, no one was speaking to each other. So what we did with part of the money that we were allotted was we had a very large task force. Our task force brought in all different agencies dealing with the federal government. We had the FBI, we had Homeland Security, we had local law enforcement, Los Angeles Police Department, Long Beach, Orange County. We had all different prosecutors come in. We had the Department of Children and Family Services, we had probation. So we had a huge task force so we can attack the issue from all ends. When I say attack the issue from all ends, what we find is the majority of the young people who are trafficked were part of the system. And when I say part of the system, they were either probation or they were a part of dependency proceedings. Maybe they were taken away from their parents for abuse, whether or not it's sexual or physical abuse, and they were put into the system. Many of these young people who go into the system, they're not going to stay there. They'll run away or they will be released. And when they're released, they may end up in the hands of the trafficker. That we were finding was really prevalent because when we did stings or we went out to certain areas where trafficking was most prevalent, we were finding a lot of young people. Where are these young people coming from? And we discovered they were coming from Department of Children and Family Services, or they were coming from probation services. So we needed to address that issue because the majority of these young people cannot survive on the streets on their own. So the trafficker has unlimited supply, unlimited resources. So we needed to address that issue. So we were addressing that issue instead of incarcerating or punishing the victims of human trafficking. We were trying to get them services. So we were trying to have a holistic approach. When I say services, if they needed psychological counseling, if they needed drug counseling, if they needed help getting a job or help getting housing. So we built them up to hopefully address that particular issue. We also work from the aspect of buy-in from the community, because one thing that you realize, you can't necessarily arrest your way out of this problem. Yes, you can have tough laws. That's where you need to start in order to address the issue. But you also have to address the other social aspects of human trafficking. So when you educate the public or you work within the public system, so they can see that these individuals, these victims are truly victims. They're not your throwaways. They're not just your runaways. You have to have buy-in from the public. So what we started to do was work within your community organizations, work within your churches. So people who are actually in the community may know these girls, may know these traffickers. And for a while, it was working. We have a gang issue in Los Angeles County in California, and pretty much throughout the United States, but especially in LA County, we have some very prevalent gangs, and they are organized in trafficking these young victims. And when I say they're organized, they will use either force, fear, duress, in order to get them to be compliant. And some of them even use the idea of, I love you. If you do this for me, then we can make all this money together. But they're not making this money together. They are basically $1 billion industry, and these victims see none of this money. They may get their hair done. They may get clothes that they can wear when they're being trafficked in order to lure in more customers, but they don't get any of it. And in LA County, it's $1 billion industry. So while we understood what some of the issues were in enforcement, the size of LA County, the size of California, and the size of the US, so we had to address all those issues. And for many years, it was working. But just like other countries, especially if it's a second and third world country, we also have issues with political turmoil. I don't like to use that word in LA, but we also have changes. And some of the changes that we have seen in the last couple of years have affected the way enforcement happens in the Los Angeles area and what we can do. And one of the things that we noticed is the economic stability in certain areas, and how politics play into it, budget cuts. And we've had some huge budget cuts in the billions, which have affected our ability to have enforcement, have affected our ability to go out and give services to victims who need the services. So it's not just, so sometimes people have an image of California that it's the land of milk and honey and everything is great. But when you peel back the services, we have a lot of the same issues as many other countries do. And we try to address them. And one of the things when we're addressing them, we're always talking about you need to follow the money. So we have started to try to follow the money more, and we have to follow the victim. So when we go back into saying, well, okay, a lot of the money that we were using to have enforcement, because it does take a great deal of money in order to have the services for the victim. And you have to look at it.
Sorry to interrupt, 1 minute left.
You have to look at it sometimes as if it's a cancer. And when you have cancer, you may not just address it in one way. For us, we are looking at it and addressing it in multiple different ways. The criminal aspect, having tough laws in order to punish the perpetrators of these crimes. And our laws, some of them can have life sentences. I've prosecuted cases where I've sent traffickers to prison for life with parole, but usually not for like at least 30 to 50 years. We also have the social services aspect, get the buy-in from the community. We also have the collaborative aspect insofar as you have to bring in multiple different sources, multiple different agencies, all to work together to address that huge problem. And it is a problem that affects, yes, you think in terms of the lower socioeconomic aspect, but we've also had cases where traffickers have trafficked people who are quote unquote have famous children, Because once you have the internet, which help proliferate trafficking in persons, and everyone has access to the internet. So when looking at how to address the problem, you just have to think a bit more in terms of a multi-source approach in order to try to do away. I don't think you'll ever be able to eliminate it 100%. You at least hopefully can get it down to a level where victims don't have to suffer because people are using them as a commodity. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. So we'll move here, and thank you to all of our speakers. That was really fantastic. So I would ask our speakers to put their videos on. And for our audience, I'm going to start off with about 15 minutes of questions, and then we'll start taking questions from the audience. Once again, I'd suggest that you use the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen. So I'll start off, and I know that perhaps some of this was alluded to, but to what extent, and this is for everybody, to what extent do criminal organizations overlap in their business dealings with respect to wildlife, cultural, and human trafficking?
I can say, well, in California, what we've also tried to do in LA County, like when you say businesses, there are a lot of hotels and motels who are benefiting from human trafficking insofar they know what is going on, and they give special rates when people are brought in using their hotels to facilitate human trafficking. So we've tried to do a civil seizing of the hotels, so we'll do it in their pocketbook. Because if the hotel owner or business is not going to comply with the laws, then we're going to do what we need to do to try to take away that hotel or motel. We'll get them in the pocketbook. Great.
Anybody else? Perhaps Tanya, I know that you study many of these criminal organizations.
Yeah, thank you. So I think this area, what we call convergence of these markets together, I think it's a really emerging area of research, and that we're finding out a lot of overlap between these, that you do see not only organizations using the same routes, but organizations moving different items in black markets. I mean, I think we know more probably about drugs and wildlife overlapping quite significantly in certain parts of the world, but we do see possibilities of cultural artifacts and wildlife being in, mixed consignments, or and I'm not sure in California, Jane, if there's been cases, but we know that there's human trafficking violations in fishing, for instance, and other kind of industries. And I've had a colleague now, he's back teaching at the People's Security Academy in Vietnam, and his own research, he found that there's forced labor in timber as well. So I think we do see a lot of overlaps of these markets, and we're starting to learn a lot more in this area.
This is Peter. I agree. I think there's a potential for that, certainly. I suspect, though, it would be more prevalent in certain areas than other areas. For example, Latin America, where there are lots of cultural antiquities that are trafficked, and then also lots of animals which are trafficked. So certain areas, I think, more than others would be my comment to Tanya.
Okay, great. Another cross-cutting question for everybody. Are there, so in terms of actually stopping this illegal trade, are there any sort of advanced tools or methods, for example, artificial intelligence, information sharing, sniffer dogs, or scanning equipment, or international cooperation mechanisms that we should be using more of or underutilizing to support law enforcement and customs to better detect and disrupt these illegal activities?
I could address that for cultural antiquities very briefly. The U.S. government, U.S. Customs, the State Department has a very, very extensive program working with other countries on this issue. So they're doing it, I guess, through training and then also through just coordination in general through mutual assistance treaties. So you should be aware of that in the cultural antiquities field.
Great.
I don't know if John or Tanya would be in a better position, but I do know about sniffer dogs being used to detect wildlife. Of course, now there are ways to scan, for example, for drugs. There are these organic things. So there are people finding wildlife in the scanners, especially male parcels. Here in Brazil, this is a reality. And also, but everything that can create delays sometimes is not seen with good eyes by airport managers, etc. So this is a problem. We could be detecting much more. However, from what I understand, the best way is to analyze the risk profiles of passengers and of cargoes and of companies, because this is where the major seizures are conducted. It's when you have a previous investigation, a higher risk profile, rather than just by chance. But yes, there are ways, and criminals are always co-evolving with us to hide everything and go their way around, because if there is people willing to buy, traffickers will sell. This is what this panel is about.
So I guess I should disclose that I just recently produced a report on some of these tools, and frankly, I'm really high on artificial intelligence and the potential there. There are some programs in South Africa, the United Kingdom, Microsoft and others, IATA, who are working on integrating artificial intelligence and scanning equipment to automatically detect wildlife products, but it could also be used for cultural artifacts. Likewise, I think that perhaps they could track the data and the trends to more effectively target. So I think that that's an emerging area.
But Andrew, if I may, this is something that Freeland and other organizations as well do a lot. It's enhancing the cross-border coordination between different agencies. So Interpol does that, Freeland does that, I think other organizations also. So sometimes it's as simple as a WhatsApp. You know who to connect, you know who to talk to. And then if you have trust, if you met that person before, I know, we should be thinking about institutions and not so much about persons, but trust is built between persons. And when we have this interagency transnational groups and people communicate and they learn who they can call, this is great to combat cross-border trafficking.
Absolutely. And having the information sharing systems helps, but you need to have someone on the other end who you're trusting. So I think that John alluded to some of the momentum here. I'm going to switch to wildlife trafficking. So what are the chances, do you think, that CITES or UNTOC will adopt the End Wildlife Crime proposed amendments?
Thanks, Andrew. And let me just pick up what you said before and to congratulate you on that publication on how we can use existing and emerging technologies. I think it's a great publication. You should share the link with everyone. And just to pick up with Juliana's point as well about the importance of cooperation, I think this was reflected in Jane's comments as well. She was looking in a state and between counties and within a particular country, but it's the same that applies at an international level. If you're combating transnational crime, you need cooperation across borders. And it has to be within treaties, it has to be within institutions, but as Juliana said, it has to be between individuals, but we need to get the whole framework right. Now, in terms of the two amendments that we've proposed to CITES and to the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, there are very different routes for making those particular changes. CITES is an existing instrument, also known as the Washington Convention, because it was adopted in Washington, DC back in 1973. It has a particular process for amending the convention. So 1/3 of parties can put forward a proposition in terms of what changes they'd like to see, and 2/3 of parties are required to accept those changes, in which case they'll be adopted, and then the amended convention or the amendments will be open for signature and ratification. So that's one. The thing with CITES, though, it has an existing constituency. So it has some people around the convention that are quite protective of the existing convention text. People sometimes that live with a particular convention or treaty for a long time, they don't like the idea of it being changed. What we say is that the convention's good, but it's dated. It's not a contemporary instrument any longer. You can't just look at wildlife trade through the lens of biodiversity conservation or biological conservation. You have to look at the implications for wildlife, for human health and animal health as well. So there is a route to change it. Whether or not it'll happen, it depends whether or not countries pick up on it. Now, we're speaking to a lot of countries. I think all countries want to adopt a One Health approach to these issues, to wildlife trade, markets and consumption. You can amend CITES at international level. There's push for a new international agreement under the World Health Organization. It's not necessarily looking at this stage of preventing spillover from wild animals to humans, but it could happen. So there are different routes to home. On the UNCTOC, the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, this is about putting in place a protocol, so a separate agreement, but under the umbrella of the UNCTOC. That has doesn't have the same sort of constituency around it in terms of people that have lived with this idea for a long time. So it's quite fresh and new. And it's building at quite a bit of momentum. We've had the presidents of Gabon and Costa Rica come out very strongly yesterday in support of that. Minister Lee White of Gabon spoke at the opening general session of the Commission on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice that's meeting in Vienna at the moment, making a very impassioned plea for having a protocol. And I think we're going to see quite a bit of momentum pick up for this. Again, what you have to do is get a negotiating mandate. With a negotiating mandate, you can negotiate the text, and then if the text is adopted, it's open for signature and ratification. But this seems to be attracting quite a bit of attention, not just for preventing pandemics, but fighting climate change, protecting biodiversity, addressing issues of serious harm caused by these wildlife crimes. And one of the problems with the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, to trigger it at the moment, you need to have a penalty of 4 years or more. So you have to have a penalty of 4 years incarceration or more. You don't always want to incarcerate people for 4 years or more for some of these crimes. You want to criminalize it, but you want to have a wider range of penalty options. And in addition, there's nothing specific in there. It's about cooperation, but there's nothing specific in there about how you can prevent and combat wildlife crime. So what conduct should be criminalized, as Tanya was saying, and then what sort of levels of cooperation do you want for combating and preventing? So I think that's got a reasonable amount of momentum. It's a heavy lift. It's a long way to go. We've only had 2 countries express themselves so far, but they're biodiverse, rich countries, environmental leaders. So I want everyone on this call to lobby your own country and get them on board and get them to rally behind this proposal for a protocol.
Sounds great. I have another cross-cutting question for everyone, and then I'm going to start taking some questions from the audience. So, and Jane, you've alluded to this, and perhaps Peter, I'm sure that it's applicable too. How has the internet facilitated these various forms of trafficking, and how can we better police internet transactions?
I could speak to that for cultural antiquities. I think so what the internet has done is it's sort of lowered the bar for selling items, and it's also opened up markets for people in one country to sell items to another country. And this becomes a problem when one of the countries has strict laws against selling types of material. The place where this happens a lot is eBay. And so there's a lot of allegations that illicit material is on eBay. I think it could be easily solved if eBay actually looked at where items are being sold and determining if it's illicit to sell them there. But eBay doesn't do that, of course. So, instead we have, constant complaints about this. It's hard to say how serious it is. It appears to be mostly low value items, but it does happen. So I agree with you. Technology has increased the ability to sell this type of material.
I know that Google, I believe has, maybe it's not Google, but it's someone else. They developed a sort of algorithm that monitors, I guess, whether it's, websites looking for keywords. And I think that that's helped to detect, at least in the case of wildlife trafficking. Not sure if there are similar sort of technologies out there, that could be used for cultural artifacts.
I'm sure they could be, and I'm sure that's going to be a trend going forward. It's just getting the companies to do it, to police themselves, really, I think, is the big issue there, rather than trying to have customs address it, on this end. It's better to be dealt with at the source, in my view.
Any other thoughts on that? It looks like Juliana.
Jane's first. I saw she was
Oh,
ready to.
thank you. One of the things the internet allows people to be invisible. And most people, like even taking it down to a very more personal level, most adults give their children unfettered access to the internet, which is a problem. And I try to tell my friends, that you can't just let your children have unfettered access to the internet, because we've had so many cases where young people have been lured away, whether or not it's from probation or dependency, lured into trafficking through the internet because they're talking to someone who they don't really know who it is. Do I have a solution to how to restrict access to the internet for children? I don't have any, so good luck for those of you who do. But it's one of the things is we also have to be careful of our own behavior. Luckily, we've had there are some celebrities who have donated millions in coming up with programs to help us better police the internet. So that has been very, very helpful in coming up with, like you said, the algorithms to monitor the internet. But believe it or not, there are some sites, it's your Facebooks, who have given us a lot of pushback when we want to get information dealing with people who are trafficking, who are using Facebook or say Snapchat, which I believe is located in Canada, so it gives us some issues. They're not as helpful as we would like them to be. And so maybe we need a little bit more pressure so we can get a little bit more help from these major billion-dollar corporations in turning over information more readily so we can use that, not to spy on people, because everyone's in America, your First Amendment privacy, but there are sometimes we have to walk that line between your privacy, your First Amendment, and protecting, say, species or plants or children. So, thank you.
Here in Brazil, and I think all over the world, the internet, social media, and etc. has increased wildlife trafficking because now consumers can connect with traffickers that otherwise they would not be able to. So it's very easy, and we have a lot of groups in social media. I'm going to use Facebook as an example, but it's not the only one. And it has been very difficult for law enforcement agents and for prosecutors to try to bring down these groups. I remember that a couple of weeks ago, a group that was actually trading illegally, not trading, but putting posts, selling animals that they shouldn't, was put down, and it was a big victory. A colleague from the Fish and Wildlife Services was telling us that based on his investigation, they were able to put down these groups. It was, rare and a first. And we also have the privacy problems because according to our laws, investigators can only use, for example, fake profiles in order to investigate with authorization of a judge. Otherwise, it's considered a violation of the privacy of the individuals in the WhatsApp group or Facebook group. So right now, WhatsApp, Facebook have become a huge, huge street market selling illegal animals, illegal wildlife products, cultural artifacts, and even, trying to attract children. So we need these companies to take responsibility and work with law enforcement and prosecutors because it's a lot of illegality and crimes going on freely out in the open. We don't have to go to the dark web to look for them.
So I'm going to move now to the Q&A. I would actually encourage if any of our panelists have time and they want to answer any of the questions that are offered, you can just click Q&A and they give you an option to answer the question or I don't know which one you click, answer live or type answer. But so the first question, actually, this one appears in the chat room. And I think this is by Jacob Phelps, because I've seen this. Yeah, I've heard him ask this question before. So his question relates to instead of necessarily just punishing the offenders, what do you think about the idea of, I guess he calls it strategic use of liability against traffickers with the financial means to provide remedies. So instead of necessarily punishing them, requiring them to restore, in the case of wildlife, maybe it's degraded habitat, or provide a sanctuary or something like that, or pay for a sanctuary. And perhaps there are other sort of measures that could be used in cultural or human trafficking. Do you have any thoughts as to whether we should be using those sort of remedies, just generally?
I have some thoughts about that in general. I think it's better to use a holistic approach on these issues, like what Jane suggested. For cultural antiquities, I'm thinking more in terms of, in these countries, there's a lot of issues with basically very poor people who are employed at archaeological sites for only a couple months a year while the archaeologists are actively working. Then the archaeologists leave, and guess what they do during the off season? They, look at the archaeological site and see what they could find. So, if these people had better, living wages from archaeological groups, it might help the situation. Also site security, that kind of thing. I don't think that's going to work for wildlife trafficking so much. But you could have something similar in terms of, habitats that are, national parks, maybe have cameras around, that kind of thing, so the authorities can see if there's any poaching going on.
Yeah, Andrew, I think there's a lot that needs to be done. You do need to take a holistic approach. I do think we need to criminalize conduct, in particular as it relates to the traffickers, and you need a full range of penalties in terms of incarceration, fines, but also you need to make them predicate offences so that you can also seize and confiscate the proceeds of crime. But in addition, having civil remedies available as well. How you would apply them would depend on the circumstances, but requiring places that have been disturbed to be rehabilitated, etc. If it's in a transnational situation, may get a bit tricky. It's certainly done domestically in countries. I've prosecuted cases myself where we were seeking a civil remedy, which was native vegetation that had been cleared, had to be restored plus more. So I think you need a full range, and also this issue of livelihoods, alternative livelihoods, of course, is extremely important. And Peter, in the conservation space, well-managed protected areas where local people are benefiting tend to be quite free of poaching and trafficking, because local people have got a stake in it. They're benefiting from it, and you can bring poaching and smuggling levels down. But transnational crime, when it comes in with its corrupting influence and disruptive influence, and strips local communities of their wildlife resource, impoverishing them and the ecosystem, they need to be hit with the full force of the law, and they need to feel some pain through incarceration, fines, and losing their assets. And I see Tanya's got her hand up too there, Andrew.
Yep, go ahead, Tanya, and then we'll move to the next Q&A.
Yeah, no, I just support the idea of liability and what John just talked through. And there's some great examples coming out of Australia, in particular, the New South Wales Environment Court, Brian Preston, the judge there, and Mark Hamilton, who's written a lot about this, of restorative processes or reparative processes. We know a lot of criminal justice systems that prison doesn't actually rehabilitate people or keep them from reoffending. So we do need to use other means of this, and repairing the damage is what we really need to be focusing on, in addition to punishing people where it's appropriate.
And in Brazil, some prosecutors are using this to pay for the cost of rehabilitation of the animals in the wildlife reception centers. And this is one of our bottlenecks, because we seize a lot of live wildlife and we need to deal with them after they are seized. but we need to make sure that they actually pay. Because, for example, for fines, we have a lot of high fines being issued, but the state doesn't have the power to actually charge them, and the state ends up never receiving the amount of fines. So we have to make sure that this doesn't happen in this way as well, that they actually pay for it and cover for some sort of mitigation.
So I know that we're running low on time. I just want to ask the panelists, if you're available, would you mind sticking around for another 5-10 minutes so we could just answer a couple more questions?
Sure.
Okay, great. Thank you. And if you have to leave, by all means. So I guess my first question is, so this is for all the lawyers who are attending, and this is from Heather Searstorff. What is the best way that we can offer pro bono hours to these organizations? How can, and I think this is kind of similar to David DiGregorio's question as well, which is, for people who aren't in a position to tackle these problems directly on behalf of organizations, what can they do in their day-to-day lives to help these important causes?
I think you could help by putting up the contact information for these different groups that have been here today. I don't know if my particular group needs that kind of help, but certainly the other wildlife groups do. And maybe they can just directly contact the Juliana and everyone else.
Yeah, I would encourage you to, our panelists, to use the chat function if you want to share any information about yourself or or your organizations.
Can I also invite people to check the, sorry, John.
No, go ahead.
As a champion freelancers, I was going to invite them to check the End Wildlife Crime, the Global Initiative for End Wildlife Crime website that John can describe further. And of course, the End Pandemics Alliance, which Freeland is also a part, which is endpandemics.earth. And it's an initiative to try to gather organizations as well as individuals working on these issues. Sorry.
No, that's good. I was just going to say we have benefited from some wonderful pro bono support. So Arnold and Porter, based in Washington, has worked with us to draft what a fourth protocol would look like. It's a working draft, but it's been prepared to help the discussion to show what the form and content could be. Tanya was directly involved in that as well. We're deeply grateful to her, as well as a number of other experts in the field. And we also had Craig Hoover. He's a lawyer. He used to be with Fish and Wildlife, now with Association of Zoos and Aquarium. He provided us with his pro bono support in drafting what the amendments to CITES could look like, again, to show to states what they would look like and what form they would take. So we've really benefited from this pro bono support. I must say we couldn't have done what we've done without that level of support. And I'm sure every other organization, like Juliana just said, would benefit from that. So we're grateful for what we've received.
Yeah, and I would echo that the American Bar Association is also a fantastic resource. So you can volunteer on committees. I've been involved and worked on wildlife trafficking matters. Actually, I kind of got my start in counter wildlife trafficking by providing pro bono service to the Royal Foundation. So I think that there's a lot that can be done. If you work in a law firm, I think that you can reach out to your pro bono department, and there may be opportunities there. Okay.
Freeland Brazil receives a wonderful pro bono for a big law firm here in Brazil, and they have been crucial and fundamental for us here. So by all means, please go look to offer pro bono, because you make a big difference in our lives.
Thank you. So I have a question from Hasantha. So she says, what should be the ideal fate for seized goods, whether it's wildlife or antiquities, or I guess in the case of human trafficking people, which I guess is freedom. Often law enforcement agencies find it difficult to safely secure and dispose these goods in the ideal manner.
I could speak very briefly on antiquities. Typically what happens is the object gets repatriated back to the country, from whence it came. There's a question about what happens to it there. It'd be interesting to find out actually what happens with some of the lower value material. Some of the higher value material typically goes on display.
Yeah, it's a good question. With wildlife, certainly wildlife that's regulated under CITES, it depends whether it's on Appendix 1 or Appendix 2 or Appendix 3 for that matter. And the rules are different. Some of the challenges I saw with CITES parties and others was where wild animals are being illegally traded, are found by customs and are taken. What do you do with them? And you need good rescue facilities. Sometimes zoos fulfill that function. Sometimes they're dedicated a rescue facility, but it's very difficult for customs agents. With plants and with timber, for example, it's complicated, but it's easier. And the sad thing is with a number of wild animals, the idea is you want to repatriate and you want to send them back to where they came from, but sometimes you can't do that because of the risk of disease that they could carry back into their habitat. So there are a set of guidelines that have been adopted by CITES as what you can do, what the options are, but it is tough. And I think, Juliana, you touched on this before, that, once you've seized and confiscated, what do you do, especially with live animals? Really very challenging.
I would like to add that when you said freedom, which is true, in the United States, we have something called a T visa. And it's, if you are trafficked, you can get a visa which allows you to stay in America for at least 10 years, and then you can apply for citizenship. So you have to make it comfortable for people to come forward and know that you can offer them services, so they don't have to operate in darkness and feel fear that they're going to get deported back to a situation which is could be a horrible situation that they were trafficked from if they're from outside of the United States. So if your country doesn't have something like that, maybe it's something which you can explore, some kind of visa or something to make it so they could stay in the country if they want to.
Thank you. That is excellent to know. So this question is from Zodinma Rozuru. And so this question is for Pete. Can you speak to the looting of antiquities by governments in times of conflict, such as the Benin bronzes? As you know, President Macron has agreed to return looted antiquities, and Aberdeen University recently agreed to return a Benin bronze to Nigeria. Where do you see this repatriation conversation going, and what are the biggest roadblocks to progress?
I think this basically is a moral issue for a lot of countries. The Benin bronzes were taken in a punitive raid by British troops. So it presumably be determined on a case-by-case basis. I mean, this relates to historical objects that were looted long ago. I think probably more of the focus should be on what's happening today. In terms of that, there is an issue of intentional destruction of cultural patrimony by governments and terrorist groups. So in addition to looting artifacts, ISIS certainly blew up and otherwise destroyed artifacts associated with ancient culture of Iraq. And part of this was really to get at part of the population there, the Chaldeans, who claim to be the ancestors of the people who, or claim to be the descendants rather, of the people who made those things. There's another, this also came up during the Yugoslavian Civil War, where Serbian troops destroyed mosques, etc., and religious sites. And it happened to a lesser extent against Serbian objects. So unfortunately, intentional destruction of cultural heritage and looting as sort of like a conquest thing has been going on forever. The historical wrongs are going to be probably addressed on a case-by-case basis by different countries according to what they believe is moral. I think, again, what's more important though is to focus on what's happening now. There's very few prosecutions of this kind of thing. I think the only one I'm aware of actually is recently there was a prosecution of a terrorist who was involved in destruction of cultural heritage in Mali. But it's in theory at least a war crime, but it's very rarely prosecuted, is my understanding.
Great, thank you. I think we have room for about 2 more questions. I want to take one from Imran Khan. It's a little different, but I'm curious to see what extent you feel that entertainment, such as film or television, have been changing attitudes towards wildlife trafficking and consumption for end consumers. And perhaps we could extend that to the other 2 as well.
I think that I mentioned that in writing, but we have to be very careful with the angle and how you put this problem, because if from one side, it can be a great awareness tool and get kids thinking, oh, I didn't want that blue macaw to be away from, their home. It can also make people crave, oh, I wanted to own one of these. How cool would it be to also have one of these? So I think that it's a great tool. We need to use it, but we need to use it very consciously, unless we're going to have a backfire effect.
Yes, there's always a danger that it will glamorize, even though the raises awareness, it also may glamorize something.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we used to talk of the Nemo effect. Everybody wanted that. It was a clownfish, wasn't it? Nemo, I think. But and then Harry Potter with the owl, and then people can get attracted. But I think the right, as Juliana said, is if you've got the right message targeted in the right way, it can be helpful. In terms of hardcore traffickers, I don't think they'll pay any attention. They're interested in profit. They couldn't care less what they're killing on their way. So, but I think in terms of broader public awareness and some of the ill-informed decisions that people make just because they're unaware, I think if it's done the right way, it can be helpful.
Great. Thank you.
Andrew, I'm sorry, but this is very common here in Brazil. So I just wanted to mention a last thing. I know I talk too much, but I'm really passionate about this. But here we have all these, digital influencers. And, they show off their snakes and their whatever and their monkeys. And this is so detrimental. If we have a singer with a capuchin monkey, the next day people will go and try to buy one. Capuchin monkeys from legalized breeders are expensive. What happens? They buy from illegal sources. So people who are in a position, to influence people, others, the greater public, they have to have in mind the effects and consequences of what they are doing. So they go on and show off, and even biologists trying to educate people, look how I handled this snake, people crave this. So we have to be more careful with what we show and how we show. Otherwise, we're going to be contributing to this demand that it's ever growing and doesn't seem to go away.
Great, thank you. I don't think you talk too much. I think all of us have really enjoyed Juliana, you, Jane, John, Tanya, and Peter. I think this has been a fantastic discussion. I'm conscious that we're a little bit over time. So I just want to say thank you to our panelists. Thank you to the participants. I saw that we clocked in at over 100 at a point. And we had participants from all around the world, from Japan, Sri Lanka, Europe, Africa, the Americas. So clearly this is a panel which has interested everyone. Once again, I think in the chat room, if Lauren, before you close the Zoom, perhaps we can give people an opportunity if they wanted to use the chat room to share their information. That would be helpful. But thank you. And if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to us. But thank you to everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you, Andrew. It was a fantastic program.
Thank you, Susan. Yeah, no, I think I agree. And thanks for being the originator.